Welcome back to Inside Dark History, where we uncover the forgotten corners of the past. Today I'm taking you into a story about the macabre history of the Halberts, the family who never buried their dead, that you might have never heard before. A mystery buried in the dust of time, a truth that will send shivers down your spine. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment to let me know, where are you listening to this story from? That helps me understand how far these secrets have traveled. And if this story truly captivates you, if it makes you ponder, don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe to the channel to keep me going. Together we'll explore the darkest pages of history, and you won't want to miss a thing. In the great silent tapestry of human history, a vast and intricate weaving of love, war triumph, and profound tragedy, some stories refuse to fade. They are not the grand tales of kings and empires, but quieter, more insidious threads that linger in the shadows of our collective memory. They are whispered in hushed tones around dying fires passed down through generations, not as cautionary fables, but as stark warnings. These narratives speak of the fragile boundaries of nature, the terrifying depths of human obsession, and the chilling consequences of defying the one absolute non-negotiable truth: we all must eventually face death. Tonight we delve into one such story, a legend that bled across centuries, leaving a stain of profound and unsettling questions in its wake. This is the macabre history of the Halberts, the family who never buried their dead. This was not merely a peculiar custom born of eccentric grief. It was a covenant, a methodical and chilling legacy forged from a philosophy that twisted the very concepts of love and remembrance into something monstrous. What could drive a family to such an extreme defiance? Was it an act of supreme, albeit warped, devotion, a desperate refusal to part with cherished family members to keep the circle eternally unbroken? Or was it the grim fruit of a mad scientific inquiry, an arrogant Faustian attempt to conquer mortality itself, to dissect its secrets and bend them to a single man's will? The third possibility is perhaps the most disturbing, that this was something far older, far darker, a pact with forces that should have remained undisturbed, an ancient knowledge that promised eternity at the cost of one's soul. To seek the answers, to truly comprehend the scale of this methodical horror, we must journey back through the mists of time. We must travel to the very moment this unnatural tradition first took root, not in the fertile ground of love, but in the cold, unforgiving soil of 18th century Scotland. Our story begins in the late 1700s, a time when the Enlightenment was casting its long, rational shadows over the cities, but the remote highlands remained a land of stark beauty and deeply ingrained superstition. It was here in the small, isolated village of Blackmore that the Halbert family first appeared in the parochial records. Blackmore itself was a place that seemed designed to nurture secrets. It was a community huddled against the elements, nestled between craggy, judgmental mountains and dense, ancient forests that seemed to conspire in whispers with the wind. A perpetual mist clung to the valleys, softening the edges of reality, blurring the line between the seen and the unseen. Here, folklore was not entertainment. It was a tangible force as real as the damp chill that seeped into one's bones, and superstition ran as deep and gnarled as the roots of the towering pine trees that ringed the village like silent, eternal sentinels. The people of Blackmore respected the old ways and the old fears. They knew that some doors were best left unopened. Into this world of quiet suspicion, a world governed by the rhythms of the seasons and the word of the church, came the patriarch Magnus Halbert. He was a man who seemed to carry his own atmosphere of coldness, with him an intellectual frost that resisted the simple warmth of the community. Records from the era, though sparse and often contradictory, paint a consistent picture of a man of considerable intellect and independent means who had abruptly fled the bustling, sophisticated society of Edinburgh. He arrived in Blackmore with his wife, the frail and beautiful Eleanor, and their 3 children, the stern, watchful William, the quiet and observant Charlotte, and young, innocent Thomas. The reasons for their sudden flight were never officially documented, a blank space in the public record, that only fueled private speculation. Whispers and fragmented accounts carried in letters and travellers' gossip followed them like a shadow. These rumours suggested that Magnus, a man with a known passion for anatomy and the burgeoning field of natural philosophy, had been involved in fringe scientific experiments. These were not the celebrated inquiries of his more famous contemporaries, but darker pursuits, inquiries into the very essence of life and death that crossed inviolable moral and ethical boundaries. A surviving letter from a former colleague in Edinburgh described him as a man possessed of a brilliant mind, but a chilling disregard for the sanctity of God's design, a man who sought to unravel the final mystery without first considering if humanity was meant to know it. Having been ostracized, he sought refuge in a place where he could continue his great work, far from prying judgmental eyes. Upon his arrival in Blackmore, Magnus purchased the largest estate in the area, a property crowned by a formidable edifice of dark, soot-stained stone and tall, narrow windows that seemed to squint down at the humble village below. The locals, with a mixture of awe and trepidation, quickly christened it Ravencrest Manor. The name fit. It stood atop a windswept hill, a looming jagged silhouette against the often grey Scottish sky, its very presence a statement of separation, wealth, and dominance. The iron gate at the entrance to the property groaned on its hinges with a sound like a soul in torment, and the long, winding path to the front door was overgrown and unwelcoming. It was a house that did not invite visitors, it observed them. But a house, no matter how imposing or isolated, is merely stone and wood. Its true character, its soul, is defined by those who dwell within. And the Halberts, as the villagers of Blackmore soon discovered, were a character unto themselves, a quiet enigma that defied all attempts at understanding. It did not take long for their peculiarities to become the primary subject of hushed conversation in the local tavern and after Sunday services. They were a family of profound, almost unnatural self-sufficiency. Despite the considerable size of their estate and the clear means to afford it, they employed no local help. The vast grounds, which sloped away from the manor in a tangle of weeds and untamed gardens, were tended only by Magnus and his eldest son William, who moved with a seriousness that was unsettling in a boy his age. The great dark house with its many rooms shrouded in shadow was maintained solely by Eleanor and Charlotte. They were spectres in their own home, seen only as fleeting shapes passing behind the grimy windows. The family rarely ventured into the village, and when they did, it was for brisk, necessary trips for supplies. Their faces were often veiled or obscured by the shadows of their hats. Their interactions with shopkeepers were clipped and perfunctory, and they deflected any attempts at neighbourly conversation with a polite but unbreakable wall of reserve. Their reclusiveness was unsettling, but it was their complete and total disengagement from the spiritual heart of the community that truly marked them as outsiders. In an era and a place where the church was the absolute bedrock of social, moral and communal life, the Halberts were never once seen inside the village chapel. The minister, Reverend Clark, made several attempts to call upon the family, as was his duty. He was met each time at the door by Magnus himself, who politely but firmly declined his invitations and his blessings, stating that the Halberts had their own private philosophy on matters of the soul. This was not merely an eccentricity, it was a significant deviation from the rigid social norms of the time, a silent and profound rejection of the community's most sacred institution. Their silence was their most profound statement. It created a void of information that the villagers, in their fear and fascination, eagerly filled with their own dark speculations. Were they atheists, devil worshippers? Was the manor a site for unspeakable rituals? The Halbert children were phantoms glimpsed occasionally from a distance never heard, playing their faces pale and serious. The family existed as a self-contained unit, an island of eerie, unreadable tranquility in a sea of rural tradition. To the people of Blackmore they were a puzzle, a source of deep-seated unease, a quiet affront to the established order of God and man. But these oddities, this chosen isolation and silent defiance, were merely the first tremors shaking the ground. They were the faint, unsettling portents of a far deeper and more terrifying truth, a prelude to the moment when the heavy doors of Ravencrest Manor would be forced open, revealing a methodical horror that would forever burn the name Halbert into the annals of the macabre. The oddities of the Halbert family had for years been a quiet, unsettling hum beneath the surface of life in Blackmoor, a source of gossip speculation and a vague, undefined dread. But a hum can only persist for so long before it crescendos into a scream. That moment, the shattering of the eerie peace arrived with the brutal, unforgiving winter of 1798. As the Highlands succumbed to a deep and biting cold, a different kind of chill, far more profound and unnatural, was about to descend upon Ravencrest Manor. The inciting tragedy began not with a bang, but with a fade. Eleanor Halbert, a woman whose beauty had always seemed as fragile as spun glass, fell ill. It was not a common sickness that the village physician Dr. Alistair Sullivan could readily identify. Historical accounts drawn from Sullivan's own meticulously kept journals describe it as a wasting fever, a slow, inexorable leeching of life that left her pale, listless, and increasingly distant. Dr. Sullivan, a man of rational science and sober habits, was summoned to the manor. He made the journey up the windswept hill with a sense of professional duty mixed with a deep personal unease he could not quite articulate. Upon his arrival, he was led not into a warm parlour, but directly to Eleanor's bedchamber by Magnus himself. The room was cold, the air still and heavy. Eleanor lay motionless upon the bed, her skin having taken on a waxy, translucent quality. Magnus stood beside the bed, his expression not one of a distraught husband, but of a detached observer at the conclusion of a long experiment. "I fear we may be too late, Doctor," Magnus stated, his voice devoid of any discernible emotion. It was a statement of fact, not a cry of grief. Dr. Sullivan, after a thorough examination, could only confirm what Magnus already seemed to know with such chilling certainty. Eleanor Halbert was gone. Following the solemn customs of his profession and his time, the doctor offered his sincere condolences and began to gently discuss the necessary funeral arrangements, the preparation of the body, the selection of a coffin, the coordination with Reverend Clark for a proper Christian burial. It was at this moment that the first crack appeared in the veneer of reality. "That will not be necessary," Magnus interrupted. His tone, previously flat, now held a sharp, definitive edge that cut through the sombre atmosphere. Confused, Dr. Sullivan pressed the matter, explaining the importance, both for public health and for the soul, of a proper burial. He spoke of closure, of respect of the natural order. It was then that Magnus Halbert uttered the 9 words that would haunt Dr. Sullivan for the rest of his life, words that signaled the true beginning of the horror. "The Halberts," he said, his eyes locking with the doctor's, "do not bury their dead." He then elaborated with a calm that was far more terrifying than any rage. "Eleanor will remain with her family, where she belongs." Disturbed to his very core and utterly unsure how to respond to such a profound and unprecedented violation of natural law, Dr. Sullivan left Ravencrest Manor that night, the cold of the winter air feeling warm compared to the icy pronouncement that echoed in his mind. A single night's troubled sleep did little to quell the doctor's profound sense of alarm. What he had witnessed was not grief, it was a perversion of it. His professional duty and his moral conscience compelled him to act. The following day he sought out the only other figure of authority in Blackmoor who might be able to penetrate the walls of Ravencrest, the village minister, Reverend Clark. Clark, a man of steadfast faith, was horrified by Sullivan's account. Together they represented the twin pillars of their society, science and faith, reason and spirit, and they marched up the hill to Ravencrest as a united front, determined to reason with a man who had clearly lost his way in his sorrow. When they arrived, Magnus refused to allow them full entry. Through the partly open door, however, the two men caught a glimpse of a scene so surreal, so utterly blasphemous, that it would be seared into their memories forever. It was a tableau vivant of death. There, in the dim light of the manor's dining hall, sat the Halbert family around their great oak table. and seated amongst them, as if merely waiting for a meal to be served, was the body of Eleanor. She was dressed in a fine gown of dark blue velvet. Her hair intricately pinned her hands resting in her lap. Her skin was pale and waxy, her eyes held a fixed, glassy stare, but she was positioned with all the care and intention of a living participant. The family, Magnus, William, Charlotte, and Thomas, sat with her in an unnerving silence, their acceptance of the scene making it all the more grotesque. Horrified, Reverend Clark demanded that Magnus show proper respect for his wife's mortal remains for her immortal soul. He spoke of sacrilege of abomination. Magnus's response, delivered through the narrow opening of the door, was not an apology or an explanation, but a chilling philosophical treatise. "Death is merely a transition, Reverend," he said, his voice calm and instructional. "The body houses the essence, the connection, long after the heart stops beating. To bury her in the cold earth would be to sever that connection permanently, to abandon her. We will not abandon our own." The heavy door then closed, leaving the two men standing outside, speechless and trembling, having stared into an abyss of madness they could not comprehend. News of this macabre situation spread through Blackmore like a contagion of fear. What was once quiet suspicion now metastasized into outright horror and revulsion. Shutters were closed more firmly at night, and children were pulled indoors whenever a halbert was spotted in the distance. But while the village recoiled, a far stranger and more disturbing reality was taking shape inside the stone walls of Ravencrest Manor. The family's horrifying secret was now their new, methodical normal. For the next 2 years, the preserved body of Eleanor Halbert remained a central, silent figure in the household. Her presence was not static, it was dynamic. The few visitors who were ever granted brief entry for business purposes, and who later gave testimony to Sheriff Mercer, reported seeing her in various rooms of the house. Her position changed regularly, as if she were still participating in the rhythms of family life. Some days she would be seated by the great fireplace in the drawing room, a piece of needlework resting in her lifeless, stiffening hands. On others, she would be positioned at the grand piano, her fingers resting inertly on the ivory keys, a sheet of music open before her. Magnus had apparently discovered some method of preservation, some arcane alchemical process that held the most aggressive stages of natural decay at bay. The exact technique remained his most closely guarded secret, a testament to the forbidden knowledge he had brought with him from Edinburgh. The psychological impact on the children was profound and varied, a chilling case study in coerced acceptance. William, the eldest, at 16, seemed to have fully embraced his father's ghastly doctrine. He treated his mother's corpse with the same quiet reverence he had shown her in life, speaking to her, reading to her, and maintaining her position with a focused, almost priestly devotion. He was no longer just a son, he was an acolyte in his father's strange new religion. Charlotte, at 13, was a portrait of silent, fractured obedience. Observers noted a perpetual tension in her posture, a haunted look in her eyes that betrayed the internal war she was fighting. While she complied with her father's wishes, reading aloud to her mother's corpse as her brother played at its feet, her distress was a palpable presence in the room. Young Thomas, only 8 years old, seemed to exist in a state of profound confusion, his young mind unable to process the permanence of death in the face of his mother's constant physical presence. He would reportedly ask visitors in a small, hopeful voice when his mother would wake up, a question so innocent and yet so horrifying it would leave them shaken for days. This ghastly arrangement, this sustained performance of family life, was a secret that could not be contained forever. It was a pressure building towards an inevitable explosion. That explosion came in the autumn of 1800 with a second terrible tragedy. William, his father's devoted apprentice, suffered a fatal accident while hunting in the dense forest surrounding Ravencrest. A misfire of his rifle, a freak event that stole his life in an instant. His body was carried back to the manor by his distraught father and siblings. For the village, this second death was a moment of truth. Surely they thought Magnus Halbert could not repeat his blasphemy. Surely the loss of his son would break through his madness and force him to return to the natural order of things. They were wrong. Just as with Eleanor, William was not buried. Instead, his preserved body was added to the family's growing ghastly tableau of death. Witnesses who later recounted the tale described seeing William's corpse positioned in his favorite armchair in the library, a book of philosophy held eternally open in his stiff, unseeing hands. The great revelation had now been made brutally clear. This was not a temporary madness born of grief for a wife. It was a system, it was a collection, and the Halbert family was just beginning. The addition of William's body to the ghastly collection within Ravencrest Manor marked a profound shift. The horror was no longer a secret held between the family and a few terrified outsiders. It had become an established, systematic creed. While the village of Blackmoor recoiled, developing a complex relationship of fear and morbid fascination with the family on the hill, the true nature of Magnus Halbert's work remained shrouded in speculation. What was needed to pierce that veil was not a mob with pitchforks, but a key, a witness who could unlock the doors of the manor and chronicle the madness from within. That key arrived in the form of human grief. Her name was Emily Sutton. Emily was a young woman from a neighboring parish, recently widowed and hollowed out by the ravages of consumption that had claimed her husband. Lost in a fog of sorrow, she became obsessed with the rumors surrounding Magnus Halbert, not the whispers of horror, but the whispers of possibility. Could it be true that this man had found a way to cheat death, to keep a loved one near? In her desperation, she saw not a monster but a savior. In the spring of 1801, she made the fateful journey to Ravencrest, seeking not to condemn but to learn. This single desperate act would provide history with its most intimate and damning account of the Halbert family's world. The irrefutable evidence came not from a sheriff's report, but from the terrified scrawl in a young widow's private journal. Her journal, discovered years later among her abandoned effects, begins with a tone of awe. She describes being granted entry into a house that was not a place of mourning, but rather, as she wrote, a place where death and life exist in an unsettling and profound harmony. She details her first meeting with Magnus, describing him not as a reclusive madman, but as a charismatic and articulate philosopher, a man whose eyes burned with a fierce, compelling intelligence. He spoke of death not as a finality, but as a temporary inconvenience, a door that under the right circumstances might be persuaded to swing both ways. Her early entries provide a chillingly clear picture of the life within the manor. She wrote, "The deceased Halberts are positioned throughout the home as if they were still silent participants in our daily affairs. Eleanor sits by the hearth, her needlework upon her lap, while William occupies his chair in the library, a book of Plato open on his knee. Magnus speaks to them, sets places for them at the dinner table, and treats them as if they are merely silent, not absent. Most disturbing of all is the children's acceptance. Charlotte reads aloud to her mother's corpse, her voice a monotone, while young Thomas plays with his wooden soldiers at his brother's unmoving feet. They have normalized what should be impossible to accept. Driven by her own grief and increasingly convinced by Magnus's seductive theories, Emily became a regular visitor and then an apprentice. Her journal entries from this period grow more erratic, the handwriting more frantic. She details her introduction to Magnus's laboratory, a large cold room in the east wing, filled with strange glass equipment bottles of pungent chemicals and shelves of ancient-looking texts bound in dark leather. "He showed me his work," she wrote. "He believes the soul remains tethered to the body by a fine, energetic thread for far longer than conventional wisdom suggests. His science is an attempt to strengthen that thread to prevent its decay. He speaks of arresting the process of departure. He calls it his great work." Her final coherent entries are filled with cryptic references to the threshold and the return, suggesting she had become a true convert, a willing participant in the abomination. Her journal was the proof the world needed a first-hand account that transformed the Halbert legend from horrifying folklore into documented fact. The situation at Ravencrest, this pocket of normalized insanity, might have continued indefinitely, a slow-burning horror on the edge of civilization, had it not been for the events of the winter of 1803. It was a season of unprecedented brutality. A blizzard of historic proportions descended upon the highlands, isolating Blackmoor from the outside world for weeks. Food grew scarce, illness spread, and a primal fear gripped the village. It was in the midst of this desperation that the true catalyst for the final confrontation occurred. 3 children from the village last seen playing near the edge of the woods that bordered the Halbert estate went missing during the height of the storm. Search parties were organized, their efforts hampered by the deep snow and biting winds. For days they found nothing, but the search in its desperation led a party of men led by the county's grim representative of law and order, Sheriff Douglas Mercer, onto the grounds of Ravencrest. Behind the manor, partially concealed by a massive snowdrift, they made a shocking discovery. It was a small, brutish building that had not been there before, a squat structure of rough-hewn stone with no windows and a single, heavy iron door. From within, even through the thick stone and driving wind, came a foul odor, a cloying chemical sweetness mixed with the unmistakable stench of decay, and a low, intermittent sound that one searcher later described as neither human nor animal, but something horribly in between. Sheriff Mercer, his face grim, demanded entry. When Magnus refused appearing at the manor house door with his usual cold composure, the sheriff's patience, worn thin by days of searching, and the grief of the village, finally snapped. The door to the stone outbuilding was broken down by force. What they found inside defies easy explanation. It was a scene from the deepest, most fevered layer of hell. The room was a laboratory, but not like the one Emily Sutton had described. This was a workshop of flesh. The space was dominated by several large metal tables, each bearing a body, or rather a construction. In what can only be described as a grotesque parody of creation, body parts that clearly belonged to different individuals had been crudely stitched together. Limbs were attached to torsos in unnatural configurations. Most horrifying of all, some of these composite forms showed faint signs of movement, a twitching finger, a jerking limb, a slow rolling motion of an eye, as if animated by some unknown galvanic force. In a dark corner, barely recognizable as once having been human, were the remains of what the searchers, to their absolute horror, believed to be the missing children. The dark unveiling was complete. Magnus Halbert was not merely preserving his dead, he was harvesting the dead of others, attempting to build new life from their stolen parts. The immediate aftermath was swift and decisive. Magnus was arrested on the spot, his cold composure finally cracking as he screamed about the interruption of his great work. Emily Sutton, found assisting him in the horrifying workshop, was also taken into custody, her mind apparently shattered, muttering incoherently about the return. Charlotte and Thomas were taken into protective custody by the sheriff's men. Both children were found to be severely malnourished and in a state of deep psychological shock, their eyes vacant, their bodies trembling. Ravencrest Manor was then searched thoroughly from its damp cellars to its dusty attic. The grim discoveries continued. In addition to the preserved enthroned bodies of Eleanor and William, the remains of at least 7 other individuals were discovered throughout the vast home. All were preserved through Magnus's meticulous methods, some positioned in guest rooms as if they were silent, waiting occupants. The full, horrifying scale of his collection was laid bare. In his primary laboratory within the main house, authorities found the final damning evidence: his personal journals. These were his confessions. Written in a precise, elegant hand, the journals detailed his decades-long obsession. The writings revealed a man who genuinely believed that death was not an end, but a flaw in the human design, a flaw he was destined to correct. He wrote of his belief that with the right application of modern science and what he chillingly referred to as the old knowledge from his ancient texts, the dead could not only be preserved but fully restored. The later entries devolved into megalomania, revealing his plan to move beyond his own family, to become a savior to humanity, by offering his gift to the world to create an army of the restored who would owe their second life to him alone. The man was not just a grieving husband, he was a would-be god, and his workshop of horrors was his new Eden. The trial of Magnus Halbert and Emily Sutton was brief and by official decree closed to the public. The specific charges as they appear in the few surviving court documents are strangely vague. They were charged with murder, of course, but also with crimes against God and nature and unlawful desecration of the deceased, phrases that reveal the law's struggle to categorize an evil so profound and so bizarre. The testimony, particularly from the search party, was deemed too horrific for public consumption. The authorities feared mass panic or worse, a vengeful mob storming the jail to enact their own justice. The community of Blackmore was left in a state of collective trauma, grappling with the knowledge that such methodical evil had festered in plain sight. Ravencrest Manor, once a symbol of mysterious wealth, was now a monument to an unfathomable depravity. What is known with certainty is that both Magnus Halbert and Emily Sutton were found guilty on all counts. The verdict was delivered in a hushed, tense courtroom, the weight of the crimes seeming to suck the very air from the room. The sentence was absolute and inevitable death by hanging. A sense of grim final justice settled over the region. The monster had been caught, his secrets exposed, and the natural order was to be restored with the snap of a rope. The law had spoken, and the nightmare, it seemed, was finally over. The townsfolk could begin the long, difficult process of forgetting. But the Halbert legacy was not one that would be ended so easily by the simple mechanics of mortal law. A final impossible chapter was about to begin. The verdict had been delivered, and a semblance of order, however fragile, had been restored to the Scottish Highlands. In their cold stone cells, Magnus Halbert and his disciple Emily Sutton awaited the hangman's rope. For the people of Blackmore, the looming execution promised a final definitive end to the nightmare. It was to be the full stop at the end of a terrifying chapter, a reassertion of mortal law over unnatural depravity. Justice, it seemed, was at hand, but the legacy of the Halberts was not one that would be concluded by the simple mechanics of mortal law. The story was not over. In fact, the most impossible chapter was about to begin. On the scheduled morning of the execution, a grim dawn broke over the county jail. A small crowd had gathered, their faces stern, waiting for the tolling of the bell that would signal justice had been served. But the bell never tolled. Instead, a wave of confusion and disbelief emanated from the jailhouse. The guards, making their final rounds, had found the cells of Magnus Halbert and Emily Sutton empty. This was not a simple escape. The iron doors were still locked, bolted from the outside. The guards on duty swore on their lives that they had heard nothing, seen nothing. The prisoners had not broken out. They had simply vanished, dissolving into the night air as if they were never there at all. Panic and chaos erupted. A frantic county-wide search was launched, but it was useless. As Sheriff Mercer and his men grappled with the impossible event, at the jail, a second simultaneous discovery was made at Ravencrest Manor. The two constables assigned to guard the House of Horrors, a place now considered deeply unholy, reported that the preserved bodies of Eleanor and William Halbert were also gone. They had disappeared from their funereal thrones within the locked and sealed manor, leaving behind only empty chairs and a profound, lingering chill. The coordination was too perfect, too impossible. This was not the work of human accomplices. This was something else entirely. The final terrifying piece of this new puzzle came 3 days later. A lone shepherd, high on the misty moors in the early morning light, reported seeing a sight that would brand itself into local folklore forever. He spoke of 5 figures moving in a silent single-file line across the desolate landscape. A tall man, a woman, 2 small children, and an adolescent boy. All 5, he swore, moved with the same stiff, unnatural gait, their limbs seeming to move with the jerky, marionette-like motion of things not properly alive. This was the last confirmed sighting of the Halbert family in Blackmore. They had not been defeated by justice. They had transcended it, collapsing the boundary between criminal case and supernatural legend. With their disappearance, Ravencrest Manor was fully abandoned to the elements. Over the decades, its roof collapsed, its stone walls crumbled, and nature slowly reclaimed the cursed ground, leaving only a skeletal ruin, a physical monument to the family that had once lived and perhaps never died there. The disappearance from Blackmore did not end the story of the Halberts. It merely globalized it. The family, now a nomadic entity of living and preserved, was redefined not as a memory, but as an enduring, wandering horror. For the next century and a half, the Halbert legacy became a haunting international cold case, a trail of scattered, disturbing encounters documented by physicians, lawmen, and private investigators across 2 continents. The pattern, separated by decades and thousands of miles, was always chillingly consistent. In 1837, a physician in a small village in northern France documented his encounter with a reclusive family named Halford. Called to attend to an elderly matriarch, he found the woman clearly deceased, yet the family insisted she was merely in a deep sleep. The physician noted in his report the patriarch's strangely rigid movements and the family's sudden traceless disappearance when local authorities began to ask questions. Decades later, similar accounts emerged from Austria and the remote regions of Romania, a family fixated on preserving their dead, whispers of strange chemical odors and an unnatural stillness among its members. The most credible and perhaps most terrifying piece of evidence from this period came not from a fleeting glance but from a prolonged investigation. In 1923, a private detective named Richard Thornton was hired to investigate a reclusive family living in an isolated manner in the Carpathian Mountains. His detailed report, discovered among his effects after his own death, describes a family of 5. He noted that the family matriarch was treated like a piece of furniture, never speaking, never eating, and frequently repositioned around the house. He wrote, "I cannot say with certainty that these are the infamous Halberts of Blackmore, but if they are not, then they are their spiritual successors. In every way that matters, they carry the same miasma of death postponed, rather than conquered, of natural law, defied, but not without consequence." Thornton's investigation ended abruptly when he was discovered and severely beaten. But the most intimate and horrifying secret of all came to light through the alleged discovery of a small leather-bound journal purportedly belonging to Charlotte Halbert, dated decades after the family's flight from Scotland. The journal reveals a truth far worse than simply living with the dead. It suggests that Magnus, in his obsessive quest to keep his family together, began to preserve them before they could even die. One harrowing fictionalized passage based on the legend reads, "Father says we must move again." The neighbors ask about Mother, why she is only ever seen through the window. William caused trouble yesterday. His movements are becoming more erratic, despite Father's best efforts. The new formula isn't working as well. Thomas is the worst of us now. It has been almost 20 years since his accident, and the stitches across his neck have begun to show through the powder. His left arm no longer moves at all, but it is Father himself who frightens me most. He is changing. Sometimes I catch him staring at nothing, his eyes vacant just like Mother's. I fear he has been taking the formula as well. I alone remain as I was, though for how much longer I cannot say. He has been watching me strangely these past weeks. I found him standing over my bed last night, a syringe in his hand, murmuring about preventative measures. I dream of a proper burial of rest in consecrated ground, but he says such dreams mean I am slipping away and that soon I will need his help to remain with the family forever. This text, if genuine, reveals the ultimate horror. The family's legacy was not just the collection of the dead, but the eternal imprisonment of the living. What then is the final legacy of Magnus Halbert and his eternal wandering family? Is it merely a Gothic tale, a historical curiosity to be recounted on dark nights, or is it something more? The story of the Halberts touches something primal in our collective psyche. It speaks to our deepest fear, not of death itself, but of loss, of letting go. In his refusal to bury his dead, Magnus represents the most extreme pathological manifestation of grief's denial, a denial he sought to make permanent through a horrific alchemy of science and will. He achieved his goal, a family that would never be separated by death. But in doing so, he raised a terrible philosophical question. In a quest to defeat death, is it possible to sacrifice the very essence of what it means to be truly alive? In a modern world where science continues to push the boundaries of what is possible, where cryonics promises to preserve our bodies for a future revival, where transhumanists speak of uploading consciousness into machines to achieve a kind of immortality, the tale of the Halberts serves as a necessary, chilling warning. It suggests that some boundaries are not meant to be crossed, that some doors once opened cannot easily be closed again. Magnus Halbert can be viewed not merely as a madman, but as a terrible pioneer venturing into territories where our own science now treads with greater caution, but with a disturbingly similar curiosity. What becomes of love when it refuses to accept its natural conclusion? What happens when the desire to hold on becomes a cage? These are the questions at the heart of the Halbert saga. The trail of the family grows cold and fragmented in the 20th century, though some connect their legend to a grim discovery in 2010. A fire at a remote farmhouse in rural Maine revealed a hidden cellar containing human remains in various states of advanced preservation, some showing signs of having been treated while still alive. A partially burned family tree found in the wreckage included the name Halbert near the top. But no residents were ever found. Did their centuries-long journey end in that fire, or did they escape once again, leaving behind only their oldest, most deteriorated family members as they fled into the night? The truth perhaps will never be known. And maybe that uncertainty is the most fitting epitaph for a family whose entire existence challenged the boundary between life and death, between history and legend. Whether their story is viewed as historical fact or cautionary folklore, it leaves us with one final unsettling thought. The most loving act is not always preservation, but release. The most honorable thing we can do for our dead is to bury them, to let them rest, and to allow ourselves to move forward, carrying their memory rather than their physical remains. The Halberts never buried their dead, and in doing so they may have lost the one thing they sought, to keep a family bound, not by chains of flesh and chemical, but by the simple, beautiful and finite grace of a shared life.